Max and the Gatekeeper, day 10. It's getting good. Alright, so Grandpa Joe and Hootich just jumped into the gateway. That's where we ended. Trying to get it out of Pakel. Okay? So we're on chapter 17, The Surprise. Mouth hanging open, Yelka stared at Hootich, who stood only feet from her. She backed up until she bumped into the gateway console. "Shut off the gateway," Joe ordered. Yelka snapped too. She had trouble closing the gateway while fumbling with the controls and eyeing Hootich at the same time. Hootich, aware of her inspection of him, covered his head with his hood. "That was very cunning. I can always count on you to be clever, old man." "Got you out of there, didn't I? You must be Yelka," Hootich soothed disarmingly. Yelka gazed without responding. "Have you notified Marco?" Joe asked. "Yes, he told me to have you go northwest at this bearing." She gave Joe a piece of paper. "He said he would wait for you." "Good." Joe handed her the gun. "Keep an eye on him while I take care of some things." Joe left the third floor and hurried to the kitchen to get some food to fill his water skin. He was about to return upstairs when a scream filled the house, followed by a heavy thud. Pack in hand, he bolted upstairs. Hootich knelt on the floor, struggling for breath. "I told you that collar would keep you from using magic." Joe shook his head. "Though I can't blame you for trying." "As I said," Hootich climbed to his feet, "you are clever. Like the game you played in the courtyard. How did you know I wouldn't let anything happen to you?" "I figured you wanted to leave, but you also suspected I had something up my sleeve. I hoped your desire to escape was strong enough I wouldn't have to reveal all my cards. I didn't realize you were not only a prisoner to Pakel, but also to the Trogs." "Yes," Hootich spat. "They wanted you alive. They needed you." "Yes, to remain in power." "And what does that mean?" Joe raised his eyebrows. For the same reason you put me there, I had become a prisoner. The Trogs gained control with me leading them. The magic I could do frightened their enemies into submission. They soon realized there were limits to my powers, and their fear of me diminished over time. Individually, they were terrified, but collectively, they knew they could kill me. They needed to give the illusion to their enemies. I was strong and in control. When their enemies discover I am gone, the war for Pakel will begin." "Now I understand." Joe moved to Yelka. "Everything is ready." Yelka returned the gun to Joe. Joe slipped Yelka the key to the collar. "Keep this safe," he whispered in her ear. "I will send new coordinates for the gateway so we can make a quick exit." Yelka slid the key into her pocket and went back to the control panel. She turned on the force field and then the gateway. "Be careful." As the mirror transformed into its usual ball of light, Joe pointed the gun at Hootich. "After you." Hootich stepped through the gateway and Joe followed. Okay, now we're to Cindy's point of view. Cindy had sat unattended in her cage for a while. When two Zanozis showed up driving a machine with an extendable arm, the arm lifted her cage off the ground and carried it while the rest of the vehicle hovered over the ground like all the other Zanozi crafts. The complex inside the mountain was vast. They passed hundreds of glass rooms full of Zanozis performing various activities. Some appeared to be doing data processing. Others gathered in what looked like business, planning, or training meetings, and still more busied themselves in military supply rooms. Smaller hovercraft sped everywhere. Soon Cindy's transport arrived in a stadium-sized cavern with a ceiling several hundred feet above her. The hovercraft glided towards the far side of the cavern, where all the sorts of creatures sat on isolated platforms that protruded from the face of the cavern wall. A bottomless pit separated the platforms from each other and from the main cavern. The craft slowed as it approached the edge and stopped in front of a narrow, unoccupied platform. Standing on the main cavern floor in front of each platform was a small control panel. They resembled parking meters along the edge of the main cliff. Some platforms were larger than others, and the width of the pit that separated them varied as well. The Zanozis lowered Cindy's cage down with one of its ends hanging over the drop-off. One Zanozi climbed on top of her cage and opened a door to the end over the drop-off. Cindy hated heights, and panic locked her muscles in place. She hoped they weren't going to make her leap to her death. The other Zenozis moved to the nearest control panel. He pushed a button, and a ramp shot out of the cavern floor under Cindy's cage and extended to a platform, making a bridge between the platform and the main cavern. The Zenozi, who had been at the top of the cage, hopped down. He disappeared behind the hovercraft and returned with one of those spears Cindy had seen them use on Elle. The Zenozi sat next to the panel, spoke to her, but his words were nonsense. He then said something to the Zenozi at the back of the cage, who stretched out the spear and touched Cindy's shoulder. There was a flash of blue light and a pop. A sharp stab of pain rushed through her arm, and she let out a scream. She leapt to her feet, rubbing her shoulder. The Zenozi was jabbering again and motioned with his hand towards the bridge. Cindy hesitated when another shot of pain racked her body, this time on her backside, causing her eyes to tear up. She didn't want to get shocked again and hustled to the ramp. Cindy was about to hurry across the ramp when the depth of the drop-off overwhelmed her. No bottom. The cliff walls were not only steep, but they were smooth as glass. She didn't want to cross, but out of the corner of her eye she spotted the Zenozi about to hit her again, so she ran the distance at a sprint. When she reached the platform, she continued all the way to the wall, as traversing the bottomless pit had left her shaken. The Zenozis withdrew the bridge, and then sped away in the hovercraft. After calming her nerves, she explored her narrow platform. She counted a distance of about 20 feet running along the side of the mountain, which was so smooth Cindy decided it must have been man-made or Zenozi-made. She then measured another 20 feet from the mountain to the bottom of the cliff. Lying on her stomach, she tried to find the bottom of the drop-off without success. All of the creatures to her left stared at her. "I know," she told them. "You haven't seen anything like me before." Elle led Marco and Max to the edge of the large Zenozi city. So now we're back to Marco and Max. The only thing that broke up the never-ending metropolis was a mountain in the center. Marco and Max built a blind, just as they had done before in Myrrh, except this one was large enough to conceal Elle along with them. After the hiding place was finished, Marco went into the city to gather information. He returned right as the sun set. He carried a small animal carcass about the size of a cat, which he tossed to Elle, and then sat down with his back against a tree. Max wondered what had possessed Cindy to help this hideous creature, but noting his razor-sharp teeth made Max glad Elle was on their side. "She's definitely here," Marco said. "There is much talk of the new creature being held in the city." "You're sure it's Cindy?" "Yes. I spoke to a Zenozi who had seen her. He said she is in the heart of that mountain." Elle stared at them, with his head cocked to the side as if he had something to say, so Max walked to him and placed his hand on Elle's back. "He says they use prisoners for blood sport," Max informed Marco. "That is not the plan for Cindy. They want to trade her for Hudich." The three companions ate a cold meal in silence. An hour later, Marco's communicator began flashing as he read Yelka's message. "Your grandfather is on the way," he said. "Why don't you get some sleep while I wait for him?" Max's body was heavy with exhaustion, and he didn't have any trouble taking Marco's advice. Max awoke the next morning to find that Grandpa had arrived with his prisoner. Hudich rested against a tree, with his hood concealing his face. Grandpa and Marco were discussing something in hushed voices. Elle watched them as he lay against the blind. He lowered his head, twitching his ears indicated he was frightened. As Max climbed to his feet, he noticed Hudich observing him. He couldn't see his face, but he could feel his eyes boring into him. He joined Grandpa and Marco, both for safety and to learn what was happening. They didn't see him right away, but continued their conversation, which involved Marco carrying a message into the city. "We want the exchange to take place here," Grandpa spotted Max standing next to him. "Good morning, Max." "Morning," Max replied. "What's going on?" "Marco is going to deliver a message that says we'll make the trade here outside the city, and only Alan and one driver should come with Cindy to make the swap." "Do you think they'll agree?" Max asked. "Yes, they want Hudich. We're also deciding on the time of day when the switch should take place," Marco said. "I believe it should be at dusk when visibility is low." Grandpa appeared to ponder Marco's statement. "That means it is poor for us, too." "We will have time to study the layout," Marco added. Grandpa nodded. "Excuse me, Marco, I want to speak with Max alone." Marco wandered back to where Hootich was sitting. Interesting friend Cindy made. Grandpa motioned towards Elle. Yes, Max told Grandpa about Elle and how he had helped Cindy. He also explained how Elle wished to travel to another world. Can we help him? I think so. Now I know you're here to help Cindy, but I don't want you around during the exchange. Max tried to protest, but Grandpa held up a finger to silence him. We can't afford to give them any more hostages. Grandpa pulled out his communicator and entered some information. Marco positioned himself where he could keep watch. Elle remained as close to the blind as possible, sniffing the air every once in a while. There. I had Yelka move the gateway between those two trees. Grandpa pointed to an area a short distance away. You and Elle can use the trees by the gateway for cover. If there is any trouble, you are to leave. Yelka will turn it on before they arrive. Again, Max started to object, but Grandpa waved his hands and shook his head to silence him. No arguments, or you will go now. Okay, we're going to stop there. They're going to hopefully do the exchange tomorrow, and hopefully they'll get Cindy back. Bye, guys.